Most of you are probably too young to remember the first Earth Day. Quite an occasion it was, if for no other reason than it substituted for the normal classroom stupor. Instead of conjugating verbs and dissecting triangles, we took a look into an apocalypse. Man, many of us learned for the first time, was maliciously intent on destroying his habitat and those of his fellow planet dwellers in the animal and plant kingdoms. On top of Vietnam War protests, rioting in the ghettos, and the recent assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, this was pretty heady stuff. What we were told in the Earth Day handbooks, news reports, and speeches was essentially that man was a plague on the face of the planet. He was an infestation of the universe. Now it all sounds pretty ordinary, not very different from what we hear nightly on the news, but in 1970 it sounded like a ghastly science fiction novel. Today I am here to tell you that that perception was half right. It was indeed fiction, but it had little to do with science. In the intervening 2 decades, we have been pounded relentlessly with stories of man's environmental depravity. Before images of spewing waste, oil-drenched birds, deformed infants, and poisoned fields, normal people are rendered mute and helpless, though the cacophony of activists is never stilled. None but the most callous soul could fail to be humbled and moved by the trail of environmental sin. Well, it's atonement time, and either I have grown very hard and callous on my soul, or the evidence of guilt is insufficient, because I am no longer touched by the pleadings of the environmental evangelists, among whose numbers I was once included. When the ecological prophet of doom says that without your tax-deductible contribution the earth will perish, I am reminded of the evangelist up in that tower where he could talk to God better, notifying the faithful that only their donations could prevent his tragic demise. Or the famous National Lampoon cover which said, "Buy this magazine or we'll shoot this dog." As Earth Day 2 rolls around, the evangelist is still alive. The dog is probably no longer with us, though through no fault of poor readership, and the planet Earth is a more congenial place for humanity than ever in history. Almost without exception, the doomsdayers have been wrong, their prophecies flawed, and all of us the better for it. Allow me to offer some specifics. First, the asbestos scare. Sadly, before we knew of the connection between certain types of asbestos and lung cancer, many shipyard workers and those applying insulation were exposed to large concentrations of the mineral. About 30 years after exposure, somewhere between 3,300 and 12,000 people are dying from asbestos-induced cancer, mesothelioma, each year in the U.S. There has been a great deal of totally justified concern over this natural environmental tragedy. Unfortunately, it has also led to one of the most ridiculous and expensive public health hysterias in history. Initially, it must be noted that a very high percentage of mesothelioma-afflicted people were also heavy cigarette smokers, which increases the asbestos cancer risk by 50 times. Smoking is such a critical cofactor that last year the New England Journal of Medicine reported that it remains uncertain whether any type of asbestos acting alone can cause lung cancer in non-smokers.